So we need to talk a little bit about sample surveys and some of the pitfalls that can occur when you conduct a sample survey. I'm sure all of you at some point in your life have responded to a survey. I remember last year the entire St. Francis community was asked to respond to a survey that asked several different questions about mascot and colors and all that stuff. So that would be one example. That online survey that most of us took would be a perfectly good example of a sample survey. When you conduct a sample survey, there are possible issues that you need to be aware of, and to any extent that you can, you need to try to reduce these issues as much as possible. One possible issue is that there might be undercoverage in your sample survey. Undercoverage simply means that a portion of your population is not properly represented in your sample. In your book, the example of homeless people is given when you're trying to, take the census and survey people. If people are, or if the basis for conducting that census is going around to households, obviously people who don't have a particular address are not going to be as easy to locate and survey and get their information into the data set. For our St. Francis survey, perhaps one of the populations that might not have been totally represented would have been, like the younger student population. I'm not sure how much credibility we would have given to the results of preschoolers' opinions on that survey anyway. Another issue with surveys is non-response, and that simply means that individuals that are in your sample refuse to cooperate and do not respond to your survey. I know I've received surveys many times, whether via email or in the mail, asking for my response, and I simply ignore it because I don't feel like taking the time to respond to the survey. And so I would be guilty of not responding, and that would be part of that non-response issue that the people conducting that survey would need to take into consideration. How many people aren't responding? What are those people like? Etc. With our school survey, non-response obviously would be an issue because then certain opinions would not have been heard. The last possible issue that you need to be aware of is response bias. Whenever you are composing a survey, you need to be very cautious about how you phrase the questions in the survey. Because depending on how you phrase them, people might respond not necessarily honestly, but they might give you the answer that they think you want to hear, or the answer that they think is correct. My brother-in-law is what's called an industrial psychologist, and his job is actually to compose employment questionnaires, basically, for Verizon. I think that's who he works for. And so as part of the application process for a job at Verizon, job applicants are asked to fill out these questionnaires that my brother-in-law has created, and the way he writes the questions on there, you cannot tell which response would be more desirable, and then he is devious enough to be able to sort of sense what sort of personality that each job applicant has based on their responses. So his whole job basically is to reduce response bias on these questionnaires so that people can't just sort of guess at what Verizon, the company, would prefer for them to respond. So you need to be cautious, again, when you're writing a survey. You don't want there to be an obvious, sort of positive and negative response to your survey questions. You want them to be as neutral as possible so that people respond as honestly as possible. So let's just take a step back for a second and ask the question, what's the whole point of taking samples? Well, the reason we take samples is because for most of our purposes, or most of the time, it's just not going to be feasible to take a census of our population because our population is just going to be too large. It would be too time-consuming, too expensive, just too unreasonable to try to survey every single person in the population. So instead, we rely on these samples of our population. Now, what we're trying to do when we take these samples is that we're then going to use the information that we get from the sample to make some sort of inference about our general population or our population as a whole. And that's what a lot of statistics is. Looking at a small amount of data, at least small in relation to your overall population, but because of the way that sample is taken, because we have randomly selected our sample, we don't believe there's any bias in the data, then we can use the results of that sample to make some observations about our population. Now, of course, the larger the random sample we can take, the more accurate our results should be. So that's just something to generally keep in mind. Whenever possible, you want your sample to be as large as it can be, or as large as would be reasonable.